I'm Fallon Adams. Though at family gatherings, I'm often the one whose voice is easiest to overlook. I've been called the quiet fixer of the Adams family, not because I'm silent by nature, but because I'm the one who shoulders burdens without complaint, smoothing over conflicts and quietly solving problems no one else wants to face. It's a role I've inhabited for years, balancing the relentless demands of my career as a senior financial analyst with the unending needs of my aging parents. Every month, without fail, I send $6,000 toward my parents' mortgage. It's a number that takes up a significant portion of my income, money I've budgeted meticulously, sometimes sacrificing my own comforts just to ensure the roof stays over their heads. Yet, this effort flies under the radar. My siblings don't talk about it. In fact, they seem oblivious to it, or maybe they just choose not to acknowledge it. Either way, I carry that weight silently, believing it's my responsibility. By day, I work in a high-stakes financial environment, one that demands precision and poise. I manage complex portfolios and guide clients through volatile markets. The skills I've honed there, attention to detail, patience, strategic thinking, have become my tools at home too. When the family dynamics get tense, I'm the one who steps in quietly, defusing arguments, reminding everyone of what's important. My husband Ethan says I'm a peacemaker, but sometimes it feels more like I'm the family's emotional sponge. Last weekend's family dinner was no exception, though it didn't end the way I'd hoped. The house smelled faintly of roasted chicken and sage, the kind of comfort food my mother insists on preparing despite everyone's protests about health. We gathered around the table, the same one where years of strained conversations and unspoken resentments have brewed beneath polite smiles and clinking glasses. I sat between my younger sister and my brother Derek, who at 40 carries himself with a kind of charisma that often commands the room. The conversation started light, snippets about work and neighborhood news, but the atmosphere was brittle beneath the surface. Derek, with his easy smile and confident tone, suddenly leaned forward and said, "Mom and Dad think you never helped this family, Fallon." His voice carried enough volume that the whole room turned to me. The words landed like a slap in the face, public, sharp, and designed to humiliate. I remember the way the room shifted. My mother's eyes flickered briefly toward Derek, a small smile playing on her lips, like some private joke I wasn't in on. My father looked away, his jaw tight, avoiding eye contact. The silence that followed was deafening. The relatives at the table gave polite nods, almost as if Derek's statement was an irrefutable fact rather than a lie. I felt a sting deep in my chest, but forced myself to stay calm. Years of holding back my frustration taught me how to mask pain with composure. I opened my mouth to respond, to explain the $6,000 I pay monthly, how I cover nearly half of the mortgage, the bills I manage, the sacrifices I make. But before a word could escape, Derek cut me off with a dismissive wave. "That's not the point," he said, his tone dismissive and final. It was one of those moments that felt like a turning point, even though nothing about it seemed new. The repeated message, that my contributions were invisible or insignificant, was as familiar as the worn pattern of the tablecloth beneath my hands. I sat there, the room buzzing with uncomfortable energy, feeling the weight of invisibility pressing down on me. After dinner, as the others retreated to the living room for their usual post-meal chatter and television, I found myself alone in the kitchen. The quiet was crushing. I glanced at the calendar on the fridge, marked with reminders for mortgage payments, doctor appointments for my parents, and deadlines at work. The systems I kept running smoothly felt fragile, like a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. I thought about the countless times I'd absorbed similar barbs, subtle digs, veiled criticisms, the kind of family jokes that chip away at your confidence if you let them. But I never let myself break. Not in front of them. Not when the stakes were so high. This role, the quiet fixer, the financial pillar, had become my identity in the family. But it was a lonely one. The truth was, I was exhausted. And Derek's words that night cracked something open inside me, revealing just how deep the wounds ran. I realized that the peace I'd worked so hard to maintain was fragile, maybe even illusory. That dinner didn't just unsettle the room, it unsettled me. And as I cleaned up the remnants of the meal, I wondered how long I could keep playing this part before something had to change. When I look back on my childhood, the seeds of this family dynamic were already deeply planted, long before I ever understood the full weight of them. Derek was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. Charismatic, athletic, and effortlessly charming, he earned praise and attention effortlessly. I remember how, at school events or family gatherings, his achievements were cheered loudly. The winning goal in a soccer game, the lead in a school play, the perfect shot in basketball. It seemed like there was always a spotlight on him, a spotlight I was never invited into. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the brainy sister who buried my head in books and brought home good grades. I studied hard, earned scholarships, and pushed myself through the kind of academic pressure that left no room for social flair. But none of that seemed to matter in the larger family narrative. My parents would grudgingly acknowledge my accomplishments with polite nods or brief mentions, but their eyes and voices always brightened for Derek. I can still hear the faint, almost dismissive, "That's nice, Fallon," when I shared my latest academic success, while Derek's feats were met with proud proclamations and invitations to brag at every family gathering. Over the years, this pattern cemented itself. Derek's opinions and interpretations of family matters were accepted as the truth, even when they were self-serving or skewed. He had this uncanny ability to shape the way Mom and Dad saw me, not necessarily maliciously, but with a selfishness that made me seem like the less important sibling. I was the one who never helped enough, who was too serious, or whose sacrifices were just expected. Whenever I tried to explain the financial contributions I was making, or the time I spent helping Mom with doctor's appointments, my words were brushed aside as insignificant or not enough, compared to Derek's help around the house or family spirit. I recall one summer when I was home from college, quietly handling the mountain of paperwork and bills that came with managing the household finances because Mom was overwhelmed with health concerns. Derek, on the other hand, would show up sporadically, charming everyone with jokes and laughter, playing the doting son who always had a bright idea. Yet, when it came time to talk money or responsibilities, it was Derek's voice that carried authority. Decisions about renovations, budgeting, even medical care were funneled through him, as if I wasn't part of the conversation at all. Exclusion became a regular theme in my life. I was often left out of family decisions, like plans for vacations or major purchases, even though I was contributing a significant portion of the family's finances. Minor mistakes or misunderstandings were laid at my feet, as though my presence was more of a disruption than a help. I remember once being blamed for a missed appointment, even though I had reminded everyone multiple times. Meanwhile, Derek's occasional lapses were quietly forgiven, excused as just being busy or under pressure. These patterns were not just about money or effort. They chipped away at my sense of self-worth. The constant message was that my sacrifices were invisible, my voice unheard. I learned early on to swallow my frustration and disappointment, wearing a mask of calm so the family machine could keep running smoothly. But inside, I carried the bruises, the quiet pain of being overlooked, the sting of being unfairly judged, the loneliness of being taken for granted by those I loved most. No matter how many times I tried to assert the truth about my role, it was met with skepticism or outright dismissal. "Your money doesn't count because you don't live here," Derek would say, or "You're too busy with your job to understand what it means to really help." Over time, these refrains became a chorus I couldn't escape, echoing around every family gathering, every conversation, every look exchanged between my parents and brother. I think it was this long history, the constant favoritism toward Derek, the dismissals of my contributions, the exclusion from decisions, that laid the groundwork for what happened at that dinner last weekend. The public accusation wasn't an isolated moment. It was the latest blow in a decades-long pattern of being undervalued and misunderstood. And as I sat there, absorbing the sting of those words, I felt the years of invisibility press down on me like a weight I could no longer bear quietly. Yet, even as I felt that familiar ache, I also recognized how deeply this dynamic had been allowed to persist. Not just because of Derek's actions, but because my parents had chosen to see him as the family's champion, while letting my own contributions fade into the background. It was a painful realization, but one I couldn't ignore anymore. The family story had been written without my full voice, and the chapters had been heavily tilted in Derek's favor. I knew then that if things were ever going to change, I'd have to find a way to rewrite the narrative myself. I've always been the one to step in when things start to unravel at home, the practical problem solver who quietly takes on the caregiving roles nobody else seems to want. Over the years, I've become the default scheduler for my parents' medical appointments, the one who coordinates rides, paperwork, and follow-ups. When my mom's arthritis flares up or my dad needs a specialist, I'm the one rearranging my calendar to make sure they get there on time, sitting in sterile waiting rooms long after the doctor's visit is over, patient, yet exhausted. These moments aren't easy to talk about because they're layered with a strange mix of love, frustration, and exhaustion, but I've always done them without complaint. It's not just the appointments. I manage the mountain of bills that come with keeping our family home running: the mortgage, utilities, property taxes, even the small repairs that pile up on the aging house. Every month, like clockwork, I log into my bank account and send $6,000 toward the mortgage, a payment that covers nearly half of the total amount. I know the exact due dates, the interest rates, and the balance left because I made it my responsibility when no one else would step up. Sometimes I feel like the silent landlord of a house I don't live in, yet I'm the one keeping it afloat. Sometimes, when I bring up these financial contributions, it's met with skepticism, or worse, dismissed as irrelevant because I'm not physically there, day to day. Derek loves to say, "Money isn't help if you're not present," as if physical presence is the only form of contribution that matters. But nobody sees the late nights I spend crunching numbers, tracking payments, and making sure nothing falls through the cracks. Not to mention the sacrifices I've made for this, passing on career promotions that would have taken me hours away from home, or turning down travel opportunities because I needed to be nearby for emergencies. I've encouraged my husband, Ethan, to support these efforts too. Ethan is a steady rock, the voice of calm when I'm overwhelmed. He's been by my side through countless phone calls with insurance companies, unexpected hospital trips, and the emotional toll of family tensions. He doesn't like conflict, but he understands how much this all weighs on me. Often, he gently reminds me that I deserve recognition and that it's okay to stand up for myself, something I struggle to do in the face of Derek's constant undermining. Meanwhile, Derek has a very different relationship with our parents. He's far less involved in the concrete, day-to-day logistics. He might swing by for a weekend or drop in with a smile and a quick apology for being too busy, but rarely does he take responsibility for the ongoing needs of the household. Despite this, he manages to dominate family narratives, positioning himself as the indispensable son, charming, supportive, and the favorite. His contributions, although sporadic and mostly symbolic, are magnified by our parents. While my steady, practical help disappears into the background, I still hold on to a fragile hope that my sacrifices will earn me respect and acknowledgement. When I see the frustration in Ethan's eyes, or the worried looks my children give me after I've been dismissed again, I try to remind myself that they see my worth, even if my family doesn't. I often find myself comforting Ethan after tense family calls, whispering reassurances that it will get better, that one day they'll understand. But inside, I feel the sting of invisibility sharpening, and the loneliness that comes with being the one who carries the heaviest burdens, yet gets the least credit. It's a strange kind of exhaustion, to give so much, so quietly, only to be dismissed as not helping enough. Yet, despite the ongoing emotional cost, I keep going. Because no one else will. Because this family, flawed as it is still my family. And somewhere deep inside, I still believe that if I hold on long enough, they'll finally see how much I've done, not just in money or time, but in love. But lately, that belief has been feeling more like a fragile thread, stretched thin and ready to snap. That night, the air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and warm spices, the kind of familiar comfort food my mother insisted on despite everyone's quiet complaints about health and diet. The dining room was softly lit, casting a golden glow over the long mahogany table where 3 generations of the Addams family were seated. I found myself wedged between my younger sister Emily and Derek, my older brother, who seemed to hold the room captive with little effort. His confident grin always made it easy for him to control the conversation, and tonight was no exception. The chatter began as usual, light and somewhat superficial. Work updates, news from the neighborhood, Emily's latest school projects. But beneath the surface, a tense current pulsed, an invisible weight that none of us dared to address directly. I knew that Derek had been simmering with resentment for some time. His barbs had grown sharper, more public, more hurtful. And tonight, he finally chose to unleash one that shattered the fragile peace. "I think it's time we said it out loud," Derek announced, his voice louder than necessary, cutting through the casual din. He leaned forward, looking directly at me with that unnerving mix of charm and accusation. "Mom and Dad think you never helped this family, Fallon." The room fell into a stunned silence, as though the words hung in the air, refusing to dissipate. I could hear the faint clatter of silverware pausing mid-air, glasses momentarily forgotten. Derek's statement wasn't just a casual remark. It was a public indictment, a spotlight thrust onto me that none of the others felt compelled to deflect. The weight of those words landed like a sudden sharp blow to my chest. For a heartbeat, I was rendered speechless. The sting so immediate and unexpected that I almost choked on the bite of chicken I'd just taken. Around the table, the reactions were telling. My mother's eyes flickered toward Derek, a faint, almost imperceptible smile curling the edges of her lips. It was the kind of smile that spoke volumes, one of secret complicity or quiet approval. My father, however, a man usually stoic and reserved, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the table, jaw clenched so tightly I could see the tension ripple through his face. Neither intervened, neither corrected or questioned Derek's bold claim. Instead, silence settled over them like a thick fog. Even the cousins and aunts present at the dinner exchanged subtle nods, their expressions unreadable, but their acceptance apparent. It was as if Derek's words were an unassailable truth, an accepted fact unworthy of dispute. The applause that followed, soft, polite, felt like a cruel echo, as if they were clapping not for me but for Derek's audacity and voicing what no one else dared. Inside, I felt the sharp pang of humiliation twist deeper. Years of holding in this kind of dismissal had taught me to keep my composure, to mask the hurt with a calm exterior. I inhaled slowly, steadying myself against the rising tide of emotions that threatened to betray me. I was the quiet fixer, remember? The one who absorbed wounds silently, who preferred peace over confrontation, even when it left me bleeding inside. I pay $6,000 every month toward the mortgage, I began, my voice steady, but barely above a whisper. I handle the bills, the appointments, the repairs. I do more than just help. But Derek cut me off with a dismissive wave, his tone sharp and final. "That's not the point, Fallon. It's not about money. You're never really here for this family." The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing closer, the sounds of clinking dishes and murmurs fading into a dull roar that only I could hear. His words were a scalpel, carving through my quiet defenses, exposing raw wounds I'd long tried to hide. The fact that my parents remained silent, neither offering support nor correction, felt like a betrayal far deeper than the insult itself. I swallowed hard, biting back the words that threatened to spill out, the explanations, the examples, the years of sacrifices that Derek seemed determined to erase with a wave of his hand. Instead, I clenched my fists beneath the table, forcing my fingers to steady themselves, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. The rest of the evening unfolded in a blur of strained politeness. The atmosphere irrevocably altered. Conversations grew clipped, smiles forced, each of us acutely aware of the fissure that had just opened. When the meal finally ended and the others drifted toward the living room for their usual post-dinner routines, I lingered in the kitchen, my hands mechanically clearing plates, my mind spinning. The quiet in that room was suffocating. I stared at the calendar on the fridge, the one cluttered with reminders of mortgage due dates, doctor appointments, and work deadlines. Each mark was a testament to my silent labor, the invisible scaffolding holding our family together. But tonight, that scaffolding felt fragile, ready to crumble under the weight of Derek's accusations and my parents' indifferent silence. I remembered every similar moment, every casual dismissal, every veiled insult, every family joke that cut deeper than anyone admitted. But I had always been the one to stay calm, to keep the peace, to swallow the pain. Tonight was no different on the surface, but inside something had shifted. The quiet fixer was no longer just absorbing. She was beginning to question whether she wanted to keep carrying this burden alone. As I wiped down the counter, the cold realization settled like ice in my stomach. The family I had worked so hard to support didn't see me. Not really. And maybe they never would. The words Derek had spoken aloud echoed in my head, louder than ever before. You never helped this family. That night, I left the kitchen without a word, retreating to the solitude of my room, carrying the weight of invisibility and betrayal like a stone in my chest. The family dinner had ended, but for me, the real reckoning was only just beginning. After that night, I thought deeply about what Derek had said, about my family's cold indifference to everything I had done, but nothing prepared me for the next blow. It came suddenly and without warning, a discovery that shattered whatever fragile hope I had left for fairness or recognition. A few days later, I received a call from my lawyer, someone I had trusted to keep an eye on the estate and legal affairs. His voice was grave as he told me that my parents had quietly signed papers granting Derek power of attorney over their financial decisions. I sat frozen, the phone slipping from my grasp for a moment as my mind raced. Power of attorney? Without so much as a word to me? The daughter who had been paying thousands every month to keep their home afloat? It felt like being erased, silenced and sidelined all at once. I replayed the conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it. How long had this been in motion? Why hadn't they consulted me or even mentioned it? I was legally entitled to be involved, yet here I was, blindsided by a move that essentially gave Derek control over the very finances I had been managing behind the scenes. It was like they had handed him the keys to the house and to my efforts, while leaving me outside, locked out. The anger swelled first, hot and fierce. But beneath it was a deeper, colder hurt, the kind that gnaws at your spirit and makes you question everything you thought you knew about family. I felt betrayed, not just by Derek, but by Mom and Dad, the people who were supposed to see me, to appreciate me, to stand with me. And then the implications hit harder. With Derek holding power of attorney, I was effectively cut out of major decisions, budget allocations, repairs, medical expenses, everything I had taken upon myself to coordinate. Worse, I learned through whispered conversations and cautious glances that my parents were planning to exclude me from discussions about their inheritance. The unspoken message was crystal clear. I was no longer a trusted steward of the family's future. One evening, gathering all my courage, I confronted my parents. The living room was dimly lit, the shadows making their faces look even more distant. I looked at them, my voice steady but laced with hurt. Why didn't you tell me about giving Derek power of attorney? After everything I've done, why wasn't I involved? Mom's eyes flickered away, nerves or guilt I couldn't tell. Dad's jaw tightened, his usual stoic mask slipping just enough to reveal discomfort. We thought it would be easier this way, Dad said finally. Derek is here more. He can handle things. But I'm the one paying the mortgage, coordinating appointments, managing bills. I shot back, my frustration breaking through. I'm the one who keeps this family running, and you made this decision without me? Mom looked down, fiddling with her hands. It's not personal, Fallon. We just trust Derek. I wanted to scream, to shake them into understanding. But instead, my voice turned cold, measured. Trust shouldn't be given to one child while the other is shut out. This isn't fairness. This is betrayal. Before they could respond, Derek appeared from the hallway, his expression smug, like a cat who'd caught the last piece of fish. It's really nothing, Fallon. Your contributions have always been more token gestures. This is about efficiency. The words landed like a slap across my face. Token gestures. After all these years of sacrifice and support, I was reduced to a triviality in my own family's eyes. Ethan, who had come with me, caught the look on my face, the hardening in my eyes, the clench of my jaw. He knew this moment was pivotal. This wasn't just a family dispute. It was a profound breach of trust and respect. I excused myself quietly, retreating to the sanctuary of my home office. Alone, I pulled out every bank statement, every mortgage payment confirmation, every note about medical visits and bills I had managed. They were proof, not just numbers on paper, but a record of the work, the sacrifice, the love I had poured into this family. And yet, none of it mattered to them. That night, I lay awake, feeling the weight of their rejection settle over me. The family I had supported financially and emotionally had effectively pushed me aside, handing control to the brother who barely contributed but held their favor. It was a turning point I hadn't anticipated, but couldn't ignore. The betrayal was decisive and raw, but it also forced a reckoning. I realized that whatever hope I'd held for acknowledgement or fairness from my family was no longer sustainable. This wasn't just about money or control. It was about respect, about being seen and valued. And if they couldn't offer that, then I would have to protect myself, even if it meant breaking the patterns I'd lived with for so long. As the night deepened, I made a silent vow. I would no longer be the invisible financial backer, the quiet fixer who absorbed every slight. This family had chosen sides, and now it was time for me to choose mine. But first, I had to figure out exactly what that choice would look like. That night, alone in my dimly lit home office, the silence was heavy, pressing against me like a physical weight. The house was still, except for the soft hum of the heater and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I sank into my chair, exhausted, not just physically, but in that deeper, soul-weary way that comes from years of carrying burdens no one else sees. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled open the folder where I kept every document related to my parents' finances. It was a habit I'd developed over time, a quiet, almost compulsive need to record every payment, every bill, every note from the doctor's office, because I feared that if I didn't, it would simply be forgotten. And tonight, that fear had proven true. The papers were laid out before me. Bank statements showing the steady $6,000 monthly deposits toward the mortgage, receipts for home repairs I'd covered, and a detailed spreadsheet I'd painstakingly maintained highlighting the hours I'd spent driving my parents to medical appointments. I traced my finger along the columns, the numbers blurring together. 4 years of payments, hundreds of hours devoted just to caregiving. And yet, all of it had been dismissed as not enough by the people who mattered most. My mind swirled with memories, silent sacrifices that had gone unseen. I saw again the nights when I had stayed up late, making calls to doctors and insurance companies while Derek was at some social event, charming everyone with his easy smile. I remembered the mornings I woke early to review bills, balancing the family's budget while also managing my own career and my children's needs. I recalled the countless times I had swallowed back frustrations when Derek's blame was flung at me, or when my parents' eyes would glaze over, dismissing my efforts as expected or trivial. The sharp sting of betrayal cut deeper than I'd allowed myself to admit. How had it come to this? How could the people I'd cared for so devotedly, not just with love but with hard, tangible work, turn their backs so completely? It wasn't just that they were ignoring my contributions. They were actively choosing to erase me from the family's financial and emotional equation. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, hot and jagged. I clenched my fists, feeling the raw ache of being unseen, unheard. But alongside the anger was a colder, steadier realization. No amount of explanation, no quiet goodwill or sacrifice would shift the family's view. I had been chasing recognition from a group that had already decided I didn't deserve it. My hope for fairness was a fragile thread, snapped by Derek's dismissive words and my parents' silent complicity. I sat back and exhaled slowly. The truth settled in my chest like a stone. I was the family's invisible pillar, the silent engine keeping everything running, yet treated as if I were nothing more than a background character. This wasn't about money alone. It was about respect, about being seen as an equal participant, about having a voice that mattered. And for years, they had refused to grant me that. The weight of that truth was suffocating, but it also cleared my mind. I thought about the endless cycle, the way I had absorbed insults and accusations, always staying calm, always trying to keep peace. But peace at what cost? How many more times could I let my worth be questioned before I finally stopped? I pulled out an old notebook where I'd once written down apologies from family members, half-hearted promises of change that never came, words offered when the sting was fresh, then forgotten. Each one was a reminder, a pattern of empty reassurances that left me more isolated and worn. As I sifted through these moments, I felt a shift inside me, a move from quiet endurance to a fierce clarity. I was done hoping they would see me the way I wanted. Instead, I would make sure they could no longer ignore the facts. I owed myself that much. I owed myself the truth. I realized that the family dynamic was not just dysfunctional, it was toxic. Derek's control, my parents' favoritism, the years of emotional manipulation, they formed a system designed to keep me in the shadows. But I was no longer willing to play that part. I needed boundaries. I needed respect. And if that meant standing firm, even if it meant confrontation, then so be it. The night deepened, but I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't experienced in a long time: resolve. I started drafting a mental list of what I could change, how I could reclaim control over my life and contributions without being diminished. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would no longer be invisible, where my sacrifices would not be taken for granted, and where respect was non-negotiable. For the first time in years, the quiet fixer was ready to stop fixing for others and start fixing for herself. That night, as the house settled into silence, I sat alone in my home office, the weight of decades pressing on my shoulders. The familiar hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the clock seemed to underscore the stillness around me. I pulled my laptop closer and began to methodically lay out everything. Every financial transaction, every caregiving hour, every slight and disappointment that had accumulated over the years. I wasn't just venting emotions, I was becoming a strategist. The quiet fixer was shifting into a calculated planner, armed not only with pain but with cold, hard facts. First, I reviewed the mortgage payments. Over the past 4 years, I'd contributed exactly $6,000 each month, without fail. That was nearly half of what it took to keep the house intact, an amount I had quietly absorbed from my paycheck, sometimes skipping personal luxuries or delaying vacations. I pulled up bank statements, cross-referencing dates and amounts, organizing everything into neat spreadsheets. I couldn't rely on vague memories anymore. I needed an incontrovertible record. Next, I cataloged the caregiving hours, the rides to doctor appointments, the phone calls to insurance companies, the nights waiting for updates from the hospital. I had tallied these meticulously in a notebook for years, knowing they mattered even if no one else seemed to see. It was emotional labor, invisible work that never made it into conversations, but was essential for keeping my parents healthy and stable. Then came the financial entanglements, the joint accounts Derek controlled, the bills I'd paid on behalf of the family, and the credit cards that were in my name, but used to cover shared expenses. Derek's power of attorney meant he had access to accounts I had only recently learned he managed. The realization hit hard. He wasn't just sidelining me emotionally. He was manipulating control over the family's money in subtle, systemic ways. I needed clarity and protection. The next morning, I called my lawyer, someone I trusted implicitly. When I explained the situation, the power of attorney granted without my knowledge, the dismissal of my contributions, and the plans to exclude me from inheritance talks, he listened intently. His advice was clear and firm. Protect yourself legally, establish clear boundaries, and document everything. He agreed to help me draft new legal documents that would remove Derek's influence over my affairs and update my own will to safeguard my interests and those of my children. I also began keeping a detailed journal of interactions, noting every slight, every dismissive comment, and every instance where my efforts were belittled or erased. This wasn't about revenge, but about creating an unassailable record. I wanted to dismantle the long-standing narrative that painted me as a non-contributor or a token helper. The truth was on my side, and now it had to be undeniable. Strategically, I considered the family dependencies, the mortgage payments that kept the house standing, the caregiving roles I fulfilled that no one else seemed ready to take on. and my unique position as the financial backbone of the household. My plan had to be precise. I wasn't just going to walk away in silence. I needed the impact to be undeniable, a wake-up call to my family that the status quo was no longer acceptable. Yet, outwardly, I kept my composure. To everyone else, I was the same Fallon, calm, collected, the reliable daughter who always came through. No one suspected the storm brewing beneath my steady surface. I answered calls and texts with a measured tone, attended family events without revealing the extent of my inner resolve. I was a chess player moving pieces quietly into place, waiting for the right moment to make my move. The thought of cutting off $6,000 in monthly mortgage payments was daunting. It meant risking the family home, upsetting my parents, and igniting conflict that had long been simmering under polite facades. But I understood now that sacrifice without acknowledgement wasn't sustainable. Boundaries weren't betrayal. They were necessary acts of self-respect. I also explored options for professional caregiving to gradually relieve myself from the relentless demands of medical appointments and household management. It was a tough decision. No one could love my parents like I did, but I had to accept that love couldn't come at the cost of my own peace and well-being. As the days passed, I refined my plan, a measured withdrawal of financial and emotional support, timed to coincide with a major family event for maximum clarity and impact. I wanted the family to face the undeniable facts that I had been the silent pillar, the financial and emotional backbone, and that if respect and fairness were not forthcoming, I was no longer willing to carry the burden alone. Each night, as I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, I felt a strange mixture of fear and liberation. The quiet fixer was transforming into a forceful agent of change, not through anger or spite, but through truth and boundary setting. I owed it to myself to stop being invisible. I owed it to my own peace to demand the respect that had always been just out of reach. The plan was in motion. The family's narrative was about to shift, whether they were ready or not. For weeks after that night, I began to change the way I interacted with my family. Not with loud confrontations or dramatic announcements, but through deliberate, quiet steps that felt like a tightening noose around the old, comfortable dynamics I'd long accepted. At first, it was small things. I let calls from Derek go to voicemail, no longer feeling the urgent need to respond immediately or explain myself. His texts, once answered with prompt politeness, now waited hours or even days for a reply, sometimes not at all. The silence felt strange at first, like stepping out onto unfamiliar ground, but it was necessary. I needed to reclaim some space, some control over the narrative that had long been shaped by his accusations and my family's dismissiveness. I wasn't cutting them out entirely. I was simply creating boundaries where none had existed before. It was a subtle withdrawal, a shift in the energy of our interactions that only those paying close attention might notice. Derek, ever confident, didn't comment on the change directly, but I caught the brief flicker of frustration in his eyes when I declined to engage immediately, or when I deflected his attempts to draw me into family arguments. My parents, too, seemed to sense a tension beneath my calm, though they said nothing. It was as if the quiet in my responses unsettled the comfortable status quo they'd grown used to. While I withdrew emotionally, I was also taking concrete, practical steps to assert my autonomy. One of the hardest decisions I made was to inform the mortgage lenders that I would no longer make the monthly payments on my parents' home. I drafted the letter carefully, keeping it professional and factual, explaining that effective immediately, the payments would cease. I sent notice not as a spiteful act, but as a necessary boundary, my way of saying that respect and acknowledgement were prerequisites for my continued support, that I would no longer shoulder this burden in silence. It was a quiet but seismic shift. The mortgage was the literal foundation of the family home, and by halting payments, I was striking at the heart of the comfortable assumption that my financial contributions were a given. I anticipated the fallout, knowing this would force a reckoning sooner than later, but also steeled myself for the inevitable confrontations. It was the first time in years I allowed myself to put my needs front and center, even if it meant risking the family's comfort. At the same time, I began stepping back from the caregiving duties I'd long managed. I contacted a reputable home health agency and arranged for professional caregivers to assist with my parents' medical appointments and daily needs. It was an emotional hurdle for me. No one could love or care for them the way I did, but I understood that this was about preserving my own well-being as much as their care. I informed Mom and Dad gently, explaining that this help would ensure they received consistent attention while allowing me to focus on my own family and health. This transition was met with a complicated mix of relief, confusion, and resistance from my parents. Mom hesitated, worrying about strangers in the home, while Dad's pride made him bristle at the idea of losing control. But I stood firm, reminding them that this was a necessary change, not abandonment, but delegation. Over the following weeks, as the professionals took on more responsibility, I began to witness a subtle shift in the family dynamic, one where I wasn't the only one holding the weight, and one where my withdrawal did not go unnoticed. Beyond the caregiving and financial boundaries, I secured my digital and legal spaces. I changed passwords on shared accounts and online bill pay systems that I alone had maintained. It was a quiet act of reclaiming ownership over my own finances, a line drawn to prevent any further unauthorized access or manipulation. I also reviewed my legal documents with my attorney, confirming that my will and any power of attorney arrangements reflected my new stance, removing Derek's influence and establishing protections for myself and my children. Throughout this period, my demeanor remained composed and measured. If anyone noticed the shift, they attributed it to stress or workload. Derek might have seen it as coldness or withdrawal, but I knew it was much more. This was the birth of a boundary that I had long needed but feared to establish. I was no longer the silent servant, the invisible financial backbone, or the quiet fixer who absorbed every insult. I was becoming someone who demanded respect and balance. There were moments when the weight of these choices pressed heavily on me. The thought of the family home potentially falling into jeopardy because of my stopped payments was painful. The risk of driving a wedge deeper between us felt like a stab in my heart, but I reminded myself that love without respect wasn't sustainable, and sacrifice without acknowledgement was a bitter price to pay. I was determined that this time, the cost had to be shared, and that I would not carry it alone. As days turned into weeks, I prepared quietly for the moment when I would need to make my position unmistakably clear. I knew that the family dinner coming up, one that traditionally brought everyone together, would be the perfect stage for the truth to be revealed, for the unspoken debts to be called out openly and honestly. Until then, I moved carefully, with purpose beneath my calm exterior, setting the pieces on the board for a confrontation that would demand acknowledgement or force a reckoning. The subtle withdrawal, the halted payments, the professional caregivers stepping in, and the legal safeguards in place were not just acts of self-preservation. They were the first bold strokes of a new narrative, one where I was finally visible, finally heard, and finally respected on my own terms. The quiet fixer was still here, but no longer silent or invisible. The night of the family dinner arrived with an uneasy tension hanging in the air, as palpable as the scent of roasted chicken and herbs that filled the dining room. The same mahogany table that had witnessed countless strained conversations was set once again, its polished surface reflecting the flickering candlelight, casting shadows that seemed to dance with unspoken words. I sat quietly, my heart steady, my mind razor-sharp. Gone was the Fallon who absorbed every slight without protest. Tonight I was prepared to speak, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who has finally accepted the truth of her worth. As the meal progressed, I noticed the usual glances exchanged between my parents and Derek, the subtle shifts in posture that betrayed their unease. Derek, ever the confident center of attention, seemed less assured than usual, his smile tightening as if sensing the storm that was about to break. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while my father's eyes darted nervously across the table as if searching for an escape. When the plates were cleared and the chatter lulled into a cautious silence, I finally spoke, my voice steady and clear. "Since you believe I never contribute to this family," I began, locking eyes with Derek first, "then my $6,000 monthly mortgage payments end today." The room froze. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I saw my mother's face turn pale, her usually composed demeanor faltering as a faint tremor passed through her hands. My father, who had always maintained his stoicism, suddenly choked on his drink, a harsh cough breaking the silence and forcing him to reach for his napkin. Even Derek's confident facade cracked for a moment, his eyes widening with shock and something else, fear perhaps. I reached into my purse and pulled out a neatly arranged stack of documents, bank statements, payment confirmations, and a spreadsheet I had meticulously maintained over the years. The pages were crisp, the numbers undeniable proof of my contributions. "Here," I said, laying them on the table, "are the records of every payment I've made towards the mortgage for the past 4 years. I pay nearly half of what it takes to keep this house standing, month after month." A murmur rippled around the table, a mixture of surprise and discomfort. I continued, my tone measured, unwavering. And yet, when Derek says I never help, no one questions it. No one remembers the bills I cover, the repairs I arrange, the nights I spend on calls with the bank or insurance companies. Derek's mouth opened, as if to interrupt, but I held up a hand, silencing him without raising my voice. "There's more. I've removed Derek's power of attorney from all accounts related to our parents' finances, and I have updated my will to exclude anyone who continues to claim I don't contribute." The room fell into a stunned silence. My words were not accusations but facts, firm boundaries drawn with clarity and resolve. My parents sat rigid, their faces pale and tight, their eyes refusing to meet mine. Derek's jaw clenched visibly, his expression a volatile mix of anger and disbelief. For years, my contributions had been dismissed, minimized, erased. Tonight, I was rewriting that narrative, not with loud confrontation, but with undeniable truth. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument, louder than any shout. Margaret's voice finally broke through, trembling yet restrained. "Fallon, we never meant to make you feel unappreciated." But her words felt hollow, rehearsed. A fragile apology without substance. My father's gaze was distant, his voice low and guarded. "We only wanted what was best for the family." But the words felt like shields, not bridges. I met their eyes steadily and said, "What's best for the family also means respect and fairness. I can no longer carry this burden alone while being told I don't help. If that's the belief, then I will live by it." The weight of my declaration settled over the room. The truth was out, undeniable and immovable. The family had no choice but to reckon with it, whether they were ready or not. As the evening wore on, the usual rhythms of polite conversation were disrupted. The energy was charged, fragile. I sensed the shock ripple through every family member, the unspoken calculations and fears taking shape. What would this mean for the mortgage, for the house, for the fragile threads holding us together? But beneath it all, I felt something I hadn't in years, a quiet strength, a reclamation of self that no amount of dismissal could undo. Tonight was not just a confrontation. It was a boundary set in stone. My contributions were real, my worth undeniable, and from now on, the family would have to see me, not as the invisible fixer, but as a woman who demands to be acknowledged and respected. The dinner ended with tentative goodbyes, but the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. I rose from the table feeling the weight of the moment, a mixture of relief and anticipation swirling in my chest. This was only the beginning. The family's response would come soon enough, and when it did, I was ready. The moment I made it clear that my $6,000 monthly mortgage payments were stopping, the calm facade of the Adams household shattered like fragile glass. What I had anticipated as a tense silence quickly erupted into chaos, but not the kind of confrontation I'd expected. It was panic, confusion, and scrambling, all mixing together in a chaotic storm that swept through my family. Margaret was the first to break. Her usually composed voice trembled as she practically begged, "Fallon, please don't do this. We need that money. It's the roof over our heads." Her eyes, wide and desperate, darted to my father, who sat there pale, his face drained of color. Robert, stoic as he was, seemed suddenly vulnerable, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if to steady himself against the weight of what I'd just said. "I'm sorry," I said, quietly, but firmly. If my contributions don't count as helping, then the money doesn't belong here anymore. I could see the shock ripple through the room, the tension spiking as the reality of what I was saying sank in. Within hours of that dinner, the mortgage lender's office called me directly. Their tone was clipped and businesslike, but the message was unmistakable. Payments were overdue. The mounting bills on my kitchen counter suddenly felt like ticking time bombs. I watched as the pile grew. Utilities, property taxes, repair invoices, each one a reminder of the financial tightrope my family was about to walk without my support. Meanwhile, Derek's confident veneer began to crack. His usual smooth charm was replaced by a taut, defensive posture. He launched into frantic explanations to Mom and Dad, blaming me for creating drama and punishing the family. But behind his words, I caught the flicker of panic in his eyes. His credibility was fraying, and the golden child crown felt suddenly heavy and unstable. My phone buzzed relentlessly with calls and messages from both parents and Derek. Margaret's tone shifted between pleading and guilt-tripping. "We're your family, Fallon. We've always supported you," she'd say, her voice thick with emotion. Robert was quieter but persistent, asking if we could talk things through and begging for a chance to fix whatever had broken. Derek, on the other hand, oscillated between anger and manipulation. His texts accused me of betraying the family and throwing away years of sacrifices. He even tried to rally other relatives, painting me as cold and ungrateful, a narrative that left me feeling both isolated and resolute. Despite the onslaught, I stood my ground. I didn't respond to every call or text. I let some messages go unanswered. Others carefully met with calm, factual replies. I wasn't interested in arguing or defending myself endlessly. The facts were on my side, and I was done begging for recognition. As news of the situation spread through the family, extended relatives began to question what had really been going on behind the scenes. Whispers circulated, alliances shifted. Some expressed sympathy for me, the sister who had quietly carried the financial burden. Others sided with Derek, reluctant to disrupt the family's status quo. The fractures deepened. Derek's attempts to maintain control faltered as more people saw through his polished front. Margaret's health seemed to decline under the stress, her hands trembling as she tried to juggle the mounting bills and family tensions. Robert retreated further into himself, avoiding phone calls and family events, leaving the household atmosphere heavy with unresolved conflict. Through it all, Ethan was my anchor, reminding me to breathe, to prioritize my well-being. "You did what you had to do, Fallon," he said softly, holding my hand during moments when the weight threatened to overwhelm me. The barrage of calls and emotional pleas never stopped completely, but neither did my resolve. I knew this turmoil was the inevitable fallout of drawing a line, a necessary upheaval to dismantle years of invisibility and unfairness. The family might stumble, panic, and plead, but I was no longer the quiet fixer who would absorb it all silently. I understood with painful clarity that the chaos wasn't just about missed payments or money. It was about confronting the truth that I had been taken for granted, and that the comfortable family narrative was finally unraveling before their eyes. What came next was uncertain, but whatever it was, I knew I was ready to face it on my own terms. The fallout was swift and unrelenting. Almost immediately after my announcement at that family dinner that my $6,000 monthly mortgage payments were ending, everything began to crumble in a way I hadn't fully anticipated, yet had quietly prepared myself for. The house, once a symbol of stability and sanctuary for the Addams family, now felt like a fragile vessel, teetering on the edge of collapse. Not long after the dinner, the mortgage company's voice came over the phone, clipped and businesslike, but laden with urgency. "Ms. Addams, we've noticed your last payment has not been received. If payment isn't made within the next 10 days, foreclosure proceedings may begin." The words hit me hard, but I knew this was the inevitable consequence of setting boundaries. The burden I'd carried alone for years was no longer mine to bear silently. At home, the effects rippled outward like cracks spreading across a pane of glass. My mother's health, already fragile, worsened under the growing stress. I heard from Ethan how her hands would tremble uncontrollably, when she tried to balance the bills, her voice shaky as she voiced fears of losing the family home. Dad, usually stoic and reserved, withdrew into himself, retreating from calls and conversations as if silence could shield him from the mounting chaos. And then there was Derek, my brother, the golden child whose charm once masked his fragility. With my financial support withdrawn, his carefully constructed web began to unravel. His business ventures, which had often seemed buoyed by the family's unspoken backing, started to falter. Without the invisible safety net I had quietly provided, cracks appeared in his professional endeavors. Clients grew wary, investments stalled, and the confident swagger he wore like armor faltered under pressure. I could almost hear the panic simmering beneath his polished exterior. Texts and calls flooded my phone, some filled with anger, others dripping with desperate pleas. "You're betraying this family," he accused one evening, his voice raw with frustration. "After everything, how could you do this?" But I heard something else beneath the words, a fear that the control he'd long held was slipping away, that the pedestal he'd been perched on was cracking beneath him. Meanwhile, the rest of the family scrambled to make sense of the upheaval. Margaret and Robert oscillated between pleading for reconciliation and grappling with the harsh reality of looming foreclosure. Their voices, once so certain, now wavered with desperation as they reached out to me, begging for forgiveness, promising change, and trying to rebuild bridges that had been long neglected. Extended family members, once loyal to Derek's narrative, began to question the story they'd been told. Whispers circulated at family gatherings. Alliances shifted quietly in the background. Some relatives expressed sympathy for me, acknowledging the unseen sacrifices I'd made for years. Others, wary of rocking the boat, clung to old beliefs, painting me as cold or ungrateful. The family's long-held reputation began to fracture, revealing the undercurrents of dysfunction beneath the polished surface. In the eye of the storm, I stood firm, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The barrage of calls, guilt trips, and manipulative apologies could have broken me once, but not now. I responded with measured calm, refusing to be drawn into endless arguments or emotional blackmail. I knew that the chaos was not simply about money, but about confronting the truth that had been buried under years of silence. Ethan remained my rock through it all. When the pressure threatened to overwhelm me, he reminded me gently, "You did what you had to do, Fallon. This isn't betrayal. It's boundary setting." His steady presence grounded me when the family's turmoil swirled like a tempest. The mounting financial strain was mirrored by an equally painful emotional toll. Margaret's health decline was a heartbreaking reminder of the collateral damage caused by years of imbalance and favoritism. Robert's withdrawal left the household atmosphere thick with unresolved tension and unspoken regrets. The family's facade of unity was shattered, exposing the fractures that had long been ignored. I kept meticulous records, not just of payments and legal documents, but of every call, every message, every interaction that illustrated the shifting tides. Some family members began to reach out privately, their voices tinged with remorse, while others doubled down, clinging to blame and denial. The public unraveling of the Addams family's image was both painful and necessary, a reckoning long overdue. Through all of this, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and resolute clarity. The path I had chosen was fraught with hardship, but it was a path toward authenticity and respect. The family might stumble through the consequences, grappling with the reality of what it meant to lose the quiet fixer, the unseen financial backbone. But I was no longer willing to be the invisible one. The days stretched on, heavy with uncertainty. Foreclosure notices arrived. Phone calls from lenders increased, and the house, once a symbol of security, became a battleground over fairness and recognition. Derek's pleas grew more frantic, his golden child status slipping like sand through his fingers. My parents' health and spirits waned under the strain, and extended family ties frayed in the crossfire. Yet, amidst the turmoil, I found a quiet strength. The family's crisis was a mirror reflecting not just their struggles, but my own journey from silent sacrifice to self-assertion. The cost was high, the consequences real, but the stakes had finally become clear. Respect was not a given. It had to be earned and upheld. And so, with each passing day, I held fast to that truth, standing firm as the family faced the tangible fallout of their choices. The story was far from over, and the road ahead uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I was no longer invisible. I was seen, and I was standing in my own power. The days following the upheaval felt like walking a tightrope stretched over a chasm of uncertainty. I knew the family was reeling, and yet I also understood that this difficult moment was a necessary fracture, one that would either crack us irreparably or force a new foundation to be built. I wasn't naive enough to believe the transition would be smooth or painless. Boundaries like the ones I'd set are never welcomed by those who've grown comfortable in old dynamics. But for me, the choice was clear: respect or distance. There was no longer room for ambiguity or silent suffering. In the quiet moments alone, I wrote down my terms, not in anger or as ultimatums, but as a clear, honest blueprint for any future involvement with the family. Contact, I decided, would be contingent upon respect, not just polite words, but genuine acknowledgement of my contributions, my sacrifices, and my boundaries. Equality had to be the baseline, not the exception. No more hiding behind convenient excuses or favoritism. Accountability wasn't negotiable. I told myself firmly, if those conditions weren't met, if my presence was met with dismissal or disrespect, I would step away, permanently, if necessary. It was a hard realization to admit aloud, even to myself. The family I loved had long shown me that love wasn't enough to shield me from disregard, so I promised myself that my well-being would come first, not selfishly, but as an act of survival and self-respect. I imagined the conversations ahead with Mom and Dad, with Derek, with the rest of the family. Some would resist, some might plead, but my resolve was steel-clad. Focusing inward, I turned my energy to the life I could nurture and protect. My husband Ethan, whose steady support was my anchor through the storm. My children, whose unspoken understanding and quiet encouragement gave me strength I hadn't known I still possessed. And my close friends, who had been my refuge in times of doubt. These relationships were my safe harbor, places where I didn't have to explain or defend my worth. I savored their presence like sunlight after a long winter. Ethan and I spent late evenings talking quietly, planning for a future where the family wasn't a source of pain, but a choice. He reminded me that setting boundaries was a sign of strength, not weakness. "This isn't just about money or favors," he said softly. "It's about you standing tall, reminding them, and yourself, that you deserve dignity and fairness." His words became a mantra I carried into each day. Meanwhile, the family's world continued to shift without my financial support. I could feel the tension in every phone call, every hesitant message, but I no longer let guilt or obligation dictate my responses. When Derek called accusing me of betrayal, I listened without engaging, knowing that some battles were not mine to fight. When Mom's voice wavered with worry, I met her with calm honesty. "I will help when there is respect. Until then, I have to protect myself." I realized that these boundaries were more than lines drawn in the sand. They were walls I had to build around my heart. They protected me from being swallowed by old patterns of invisibility and dismissal. At the same time, they offered a chance for the family to see me anew, not as a silent backer or an invisible fixer, but as a woman who valued herself enough to demand fairness. The journey wasn't linear. There were moments of doubt, flashes of loneliness, and the ache of a fractured family. I grieved the loss of what could have been, the harmonious connections I once hoped for, but I also felt a growing sense of peace, a quiet dignity that came from finally reclaiming my voice and my worth. Every day, I chose freedom over fear, respect over resentment, and self-care over sacrifice without acknowledgement. The Addams family faced the consequences of years of imbalance, but I was no longer defined by their narrative. I was writing my own story now, one where respect was earned, boundaries were honored, and love was no longer a transaction, but a choice freely given. As I look forward, I hold on to that clarity. The future with my family remains uncertain, but I am no longer waiting in the shadows for recognition. I am standing firmly in the light of my own truth, ready to embrace whatever comes, not as the invisible fixer, but as Fallon Addams, whole and unyielding.